Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fairfax County 2023 Hurricane Outlook. For those of you that might not realize, we are currently in the midst of hurricane season, and then we are a couple months away from National Preparedness Month in September. A combination of those two things means that while we should always be prepared for hurricanes, right now is the time to do it if you have not. So, to make that happen, we have a special guest today, Kevin Rodriguez from the National Weather Service, and he's going to walk us through the 2023 hurricane outlook and a lot of information that we just might not know about hurricanes. Hi, Kevin.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Good. So, are you excited to just kind of explain what Fairfax County might be expecting for 2023?
Yeah, hopefully. In terms of general preparedness, weather information about the hurricanes and tropical storms, and we can expect if there are any impacts in the area, but also just talk about the outlook and what might occur this year.
Awesome. Then I will give you the floor so you can get right into it. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to learning all about the hurricane outlook.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me. All right. My name again is Kevin Rodriguez. I'm a lead meteorologist here at the National Weather Service, Baltimore, Washington office, located in Sterling, Virginia. So I'll go ahead and get started. Just talking about a little bit the science behind tropical cyclones. Now, tropical cyclones is just a general big word that meteorologists use to define hurricanes, tropical storms in other parts of the world. They're called typhoons and cyclones, but they're generally organized systems of thunderstorms that are rotating around a center point, and these generally for our area are going to come off of Africa throughout the season, the hurricane season, which runs from June to November. And we have several different classifications for those systems. They're going to start off as tropical depressions when they're just kind of weak, but you can see that there's some organization going on there. And then as they start getting stronger and they attain different kind of wind speeds, then we give them classifications with tropical storm. Once they get to 39 miles per hour, and then 74 miles per hour, they become hurricanes. And these systems get a name once they become tropical storms. And they'll continue to keep that name even if they weaken to tropical depression status later on in their life cycle. Now, talking about the ingredients that tropical storms need and hurricanes need to survive and intensify, these are kind of the main ones listed here. And you want generally warm ocean waters throughout a pretty good layer of the ocean. So not just at the surface, but also several hundred feet down. And a lot of that takes time to build up. So you get a lot of heat in June and July, but you don't really see the temperatures peak in the ocean until later in August and September because of that. Because water takes a little bit longer to heat up than the land. And then you need unstable atmosphere, things that we think about with severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, that instability. You also need that for tropical storms and hurricanes to develop. And then something we call low vertical wind shear. And that's just a difference in wind speed and wind direction as you move up in the atmosphere. So wind shear is good for tornadoes because it helps the storms rotate and produce those tornadoes. But for hurricanes, it's not good because it tears apart the circulation as it's trying to develop. And then we talked about that disturbance that develops kind of away from the equator. For our area, it's going to be coming off of Africa, as they're called easterly waves. Um, and that away from the equator is actually kind of important because a little science tidbit here, at the equator, the force that creates the spin in the atmosphere for these tropical storms and hurricanes is called the Coriolis force. And the equation for it is when you plug in the equator's latitude, which is zero, it comes out to zero. So near the equator, there's actually no spin, just based off of the rotation of the Earth and a lot of other dynamics involved in there. You cannot get these clusters of thunderstorms to spin. So that's why you see on the map, it's a really cool distinction of like right on the line of the equator, there's no systems that develop there. They're either north or south of that, just based on the different ocean that they develop in. And then just the structures of hurricanes. The three main things that we look at that people are aware of is the eye of the storm. So that's the central area, the clear part of of the hurricane that generally doesn't develop until like a clear definition of it on that you see on satellite until it becomes a really powerful hurricane. And because there's a lot of sinking air in the center of the eye, which is why it clears out when you have these really powerful storms. And then surrounding the eye is the eye wall. and that is the area of the hurricane with the strongest winds. And generally, where we see as that eye wall is coming on shore, that's the area that's going to experience the most amount of damage and the most amount of storm surge is going to be right along the eye wall because that's where the strongest winds are pushing all that water on shore and causing a lot of damage as well. And then the outer rain band. That's what we start to feel early on as the storm is approaching, but not quite there yet. And you're getting those strong bursts of rain and wind, and then it calms down, and then you get another one. How we that's how we generally feel the rain bands, and they also pose a threat for tornadoes. So most of the tornadoes that occur in hurricanes are going to occur in these outer rain bands of the storm. And now I'm going to transition a little bit to talk about the seasonal climatology. So historically, where have these storms formed throughout the season, and where do they go? We'll take a look at that right now. I talked about the season being from June 1st through November 30th, and that's because that's when most of generally all tropical storm and hurricanes develop within that 6 month period of the year. We do get some storms that form beforehand or after, generally in May, but the real majority of tropical systems are going to form in that 6 month period from June 1st to November 30th. And really, the peak of the season, as you can see on this chart, you start to increase likely from mid August all the way through October. That is the peak of the hurricane season. And that's where about 94% of all hurricanes develop, and especially the big ones. Your major hurricanes, which are category 3 and higher, those generally always develop in the months of August, September, and October. That's when we really have to keep an eye out on the tropics because that's when the majority of these systems are going to form. Now, looking at the last 30 years, the average of how many tropical storms and hurricanes form in our basin, which is the North Atlantic, the Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico, an average season, you get about 14 named tropical storms, seven of which become hurricanes, and then about three of them are going to become major hurricanes of that category 3 or higher. And the average dates are listed there with the first tropical storm generally forming by June 20th. Now, that's just an average. Generally, in the past, I think 6 to 7 years, we've had a tropical storm or subtropical storm develop in the month of May. So very early on in the season. And that's actually pushed that number back. The first average date of a tropical storm used to be in early July. But because of all these earlier season storms that have developed recently, that's been pushed back to June 20th. And then generally, your average date of the first hurricane and the first major hurricane, that's always fallen within that peak August, September, October time window. So you see there August 11th for the first hurricane and September 1st for the first major hurricane. Now, those are just averages. You always get storms that form before or after that date. And one thing that's really important to note, and I'll make note of this later on through the presentation, is that um, all these numbers that you see from tropical storms, how many might form this year, those are just estimates. And we might have an active season. You might get more than what's predicted, but none of them might hit this area. And so that's always important because there's always a chance that you can get hit. And most of the time, a lot of folks, you don't experience the tropical storms for a season. But all it takes is one. It just takes one storm to pass through this area to knock down a whole bunch of trees onto people's homes, cars, other businesses, to kind of just disrupt the flow of general day to day life. And that can be a big deal. That's why preparedness is always important, especially right now at this time of year when we're still generally on the quiet side. And so let's look at the different months of the hurricane season and when these tropical storms and hurricanes form. So, starting with June, generally, most of the storms are going to form kind of close to home in the Gulf of Mexico or just off the eastern seaboard of the US, generally on stalled frontal boundaries or old fronts that just kind of like stay there. Now, you can get tropical storms to form on them. And most of the time, they're going to be of the subtropical variety. So, they're kind of just halfway through. They're kind of messy and disorganized and your big threat with them is going to be flooding, rainfall, and tornadoes. And you can see there on the map on the right, generally showing a 150-mile range from southern Maryland. And you can see that's pretty decent amount. Some storms have come across this area. Most of them have been tropical storms. And if there is a hurricane, it's been well offshore of our region. but it does show that even in June, you can get something to come across, and it doesn't have to be a full-fledged tropical storm. We get a lot of remnants of these systems, and that always is a problem because of the flooding rain potential that comes with them. Now, as we move off into July, so July is what I like to talk about sometimes is a transition month in the hurricane season. You're kind of going from your summertime into the fall, and as you get into August and September, and you see a big change of where tropical storms and hurricanes develop. So again, the systems are generally going to form close to home, and you can see there's a little bit of an enhanced area historically off of the Carolina coastline up into the Northwest Atlantic Ocean, just off the eastern coast of the Mid Atlantic. And it's those fronts coming through. You can get something stalled and a storm forms. And you can see on the map there on the right, most of the storms all of the storms generally that have formed have stayed east of our area. But they're still kind of close. So that's still something to watch out for in this time of year. But the chances of it happening are kind of low. Now, as we move into the heart of the season, now we really start to get the big hurricanes developing across much of the open Atlantic Ocean. You can see there the on the left-hand side of the map has really expanded. The probabilities are much higher for storms to develop across basically everywhere, and much of the U.S. is impacted by storms at this time of year if they come across. And you can see on the map on the right, there's a lot more tropical storm and hurricane tracks moving through our area. Generally, the tracks are still kind of off to our east, especially for the stronger ones. That's something that we'll notice in this area. We get a lot of close calls with storms that kind of just recurve to our south. So our friends in South Carolina, North Carolina, southeastern Virginia, they take the hit, but the storms as they just move up closer to the Delmarva Peninsula, they just kind of start to move off and kind of pivot away from our area. So we get lucky a lot of times, but it's not a reason to not be prepared for any potential impacts. And then the map now, if I take away all of the tropical storm tracks, this is what the hurricane tracks look like there. So again, most of them have come just to the right, but there's been a couple that have strayed further to the west and impacted this region. And now for the busiest time of the year, the month of September, historically, we've seen the majority one of the biggest number of tropical storms and hurricanes that have formed. And you can see there on the map on the left, really high probability of storm formation, a number of storms historically across much of the ocean, of the Atlantic Ocean, and towards the eastern coast of the US and the Gulf of Mexico. And then on the map on the right, you see a lot more storm tracks moving across our region, and if I take away the tropical storms, these are all the hurricane impacts. And so this is when we've had the really big ones. So Isabel, 2003 comes to mind. And then a lot of the other storms that have been really close, really devastating, major hurricane impacts down in the Carolinas. You can see the tracks just curve off towards our east. So that is a historically favored track. These major hurricanes they're so close to our area, but it's not going to take much on any given year for that storm to pivot to stay further west, and then we're going to see major hurricane impacts or just significant wind impacts in this area generally. And then moving off to October, so other parts of the country really have a significant impact or can see significant impacts with October storms. This is generally a time period, especially for the state of Florida and other parts of the Gulf. But you can see the map. There's a really big focus in the Caribbean Sea and then off the southeast coast of the U.S. But generally, most of the storms at that time of year will stay away from this area. One of the big ones that was very anomalous was Sandy back in 2012. You see the track there coming off in the map on the right and then is striking southern Jersey. Big impacts across this entire region. But we can still get hurricanes at this time of year. So if I just show the hurricane tracks there, there's two, and they were kind of a long time ago, but we can still get tracks of hurricanes making landfall in the Carolinas in October and then moving straight north into our area during the month of October. And then November is the kind of just the lessening and decreasing time period for tropical systems across the entire Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. And you can see there that we've only had two tracks within a pretty big, within 150 miles of southern Maryland. So pretty rare to get a tropical storm or hurricane in the month of November. So generally, I don't say we can let our guard down, but it's when you can kind of breathe. All right, we've passed through the main part of the season at this point. And then these are cool maps looking at hurricane return periods. So how often, like what's the average time period between hurricane impacts in this area? And it's actually quite large. A lot of the hurricanes that impact the closest area to see significant hurricane impacts is the Carolinas, particularly North Carolina towards the Outer Banks region. And once those storms make landfall, a lot of them, if they recurve, they're gonna just move east of our area. But they can there's been still quite a few that just go straight inland across North Carolina, Southern Virginia, and then move across the capital region here. And big impacts in Northern Virginia and Maryland as well. So while historically they are pretty rare to get major hurricanes up in this area, generally every 1, 2, maybe 3 generations, you'll see one of those big storms impacting this region. So the last one was Isabel in 2003, and then the previous one before that, that was really, really bad, hadn't been since, I believe 1933. There were some hurricanes in the 60s and 70s that had some big impacts, but, um, nothing quite like we saw with Isabel, in this region. And then, so I wanted to take a look at where do the hurricanes that strike this region come from, and where do these tropical systems originate? I think this is a really cool map showing the tracks of all the storms that have come within 100 miles of Washington, D.C. specifically, and where do those systems originate. And you can see they generally come from everywhere in the Atlantic Ocean. So there's a lot of tracks of those storms that come off of Africa and they develop right away. So the Cape Verde hurricanes, which are those really long ones that we can see over like a week plus out. But a lot of them also develop in a relatively short period of time in the Western Caribbean Sea and in the Gulf of Mexico, and then just kind of move up into the southeast US and then near our region. And then if I take away the tropical storms, so these are the hurricanes. These are the major hurricanes. Um, well, not just major, the major and the Cat 1 and 2 hurricanes that have impacted this region. So as you can see, that have come within 100 miles of DC, I should say. So not that many. So getting impacts in this area from big hurricanes is rare, but when it does happen, the impacts are really, really bad. It's just important. That's why the preparedness is always important because you never know when it's going to be our time to get hit with another major storm. All right. So now going to move on to looking at the different hazards associated with tropical storms and also the historical impacts of hurricanes in this region, specifically based upon the impacts that we've seen. So all tropical storms and hurricanes are going to produce a combination of one or more of these hazards. So you're going to get wind, flooding rainfall, storm surge, or tornadoes. Depending on how strong the storm is or how organized it is, you might only get one or two, but the impacts can still be really bad. Even weak tropical storms that are not very organized, moving kind of slow, they can produce a lot of rainfall in a short amount of time, and we've seen a lot of significant flooding because of that, especially in recent years. So, one big thing is to remember that the category only speaks to the wind threat. So it just because it's a tropical storm doesn't mean you should ignore it because there could still be potential impacts from flooding and tornadoes. And the same thing goes for when it gets higher category. We everybody thinks about the wind, but you will still have a lot of impacts from storm surge with the potential for flooding and tornadoes as well. And one thing that we've noticed that we've seen in recent years and historically is that the water component of these tropical systems is the most deadly. Recently, it's been flooding, but historically, the storm surge has been one of the big weather-related killers with tropical storms. Like water is what kills, unfortunately. This was a study done by the National Hurricane Center, just looking at fatalities from tropical systems, and storm surge was over 50%, and another 25% from rainfall, freshwater flooding. And then combine all the water hazards together, they about 90% of all fatalities have been because of that. So we've done a really good job at making our buildings stronger, at moving people out of harm's way if they're in weaker buildings, weaker structures, moving them to storm shelters. We've gotten very good at that. And with tornadoes, with now you're getting alerts on your phone, know whether radio, TV, people can seek shelter quickly if there's a tornado coming towards them. We've really lessened the fatalities from that. However, it's a water component that a lot of times that catches people off guard. And that's the unfortunate part because we don't give enough respect to how dangerous water can be. And then just looking at the fatalities in recent years from tropical cyclones in 2016, 2017, and 2018, there's been a lot of fatalities from systems, and a lot of them have been water related. So, in the closest hurricane impacts to this area was Hurricane Matthew that hit the Carolinas in 2018. In 2016, excuse me, and then 2017 was Hurricane Harvey in Texas and southeast Louisiana or southwest Louisiana. And then we had in 2018, the big storm was Hurricane Florence that kind of just stalled off the coast of the Carolinas. And they had massive flooding and river flooding in that area for weeks because of that storm. So most of that, most of those flooding fatalities were inland flooding, and a lot of it was folks driving cars through flooded roadways. I cannot stress enough that if you come across a flooded road, it is best just to turn around and find another route. Or if there's a lot of flooding going on, don't even go out if you don't have to. It's not worth it. We've seen a lot of the fatalities in these kind of events with flooded roadways are just people thinking they can drive through the road. And it only takes 6 inches of moving water to kind of sweep your car off the road, and a couple of feet of water, it can lift a truck and just sweep it down off of the roadway as well. And keep in mind that you cannot know if the roadway is even still there underneath the water. And it's hard to judge how fast the water is moving a lot of times. So it's just not worth it, not worth to put your life at risk during those situations. Now, from our perspective, in terms of the types of flooding that we see, generally, you're talking about three types of floodings that we see in this area. So there's the river flooding, which is usually the one that takes the most amount of time to occur. 'Cause you need a lot of rainfall in the river basin. But there are streams and creeks that can very quickly rise as they're just very narrow and small. So it doesn't take a lot of water to flood those areas. Now, that's when we can see generally kind of widespread, slower flooding, or the dangerous one, which is the flash flood. So that is a rapid rise of water in a very short amount of time. Whereas normally it was dry, but 30 minutes later it could be a streaming torrent of water going down that street, for example. And from our perspective, as from the National Weather Service, when we're issuing warnings, that flash flood warning, a lot of times you will get alerted on your phone if it is a significant flash flood event that's occurring. So we have the ability to alert people via their phones in that capacity when there's flash flood warnings. But if you do get that one, that means that it's a dangerous situation. Flooding has been observed or is about to begin, and it's important to move to higher ground and avoid any areas that are already flooded. Now, we're going to talk about a lot of the flooding that we saw from Hurricane Isabel back in 2003. A lot of people remember the storm that were here, a lot of wind impacts, a lot of surge, but there was a lot of flooding as well, especially down into central Virginia and the eastern areas of North Carolina. We had significant, moderate to major river flooding on the Potomac, Shenandoah, Rappahannock, and the Rappahannock rivers. So a lot of areas saw significant flooding, and it doesn't just go away after a couple hours as we're used to kind of here in the urban areas. Those rivers can stay swollen and high for weeks on end until the water is able to just drain out into the ocean. So those are significant long-term impacts from those. Um, as you can see there, almost 6 to 12 inches of rain fell across the Shenandoah Valley, and a lot of water falling in an area that has lots of mountains and a lot of hills and terrain. That's a recipe for having a lot of significant flooding. And then just looking at some of the other impacts that we had from Isabel across the area, all the major airports in the area were closed. If you can imagine what a significant travel disruption that must have been for the folks in the area here. A lot of the federal government was shut down. Rail service was closed. and there was billions of dollars in damage across the region. And unfortunately, we did have a lot of fatalities, both direct and indirect, across Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. Again, mainly because of that flooding and the wind impacts as well from a lot of trees coming down onto homes. And so looking back, Isabel was really bad, but it wasn't the worst that we've experienced in this region in terms of flooding rainfall from hurricane. That goes back to you have to go back to 1969 with Hurricane Camille. Now, Hurricane Camille was one of the four Category 5 hurricanes to make landfall in the United States, in the contiguous U.S. So it made landfall in southeast Louisiana and Mississippi, and then it weakened as it moved up the Mississippi Valley into Tennessee and Kentucky. But the remnants of Camille moved across Kentucky and then eastward into Virginia, where there was a stalled frontal boundary. And there was a significant amount of rainfall that fell in that area in a very short amount of time. So 27 inches of rain, talking about 2 feet plus of water coming down, mostly in Nelson County, where they saw the most amount of rain, in about 5 to 6 hours. So I personally can't fathom how much water fell in that area and how fast a lot of those creeks and streams must have risen. You can see we have an image there from Nelson County just showing the aftermath. A lot of hillsides were just eroded away. The landslides were prolific in that area, and there was at least 151 fatalities from that storm there. So a very significant flooding impact, and that's something that we're always fearful of with storms that make landfall far away from the area, but the remnants and all the rain that could come from that. We saw that with the remnants of Hurricane Ida across the Philadelphia and New York City areas back in 2021. It was not a lot of wind, a few tornadoes, but the rainfall caused a significant amount of flash flooding in Philly and New York City. So it doesn't take a direct landfall in this area for there to be significant impacts. We always have to watch the remnants of storms as they move up from the south. And so I'm going to pivot a little bit to the storm surge now. And storm surge is really dependent on several factors, namely how big the storm is, how strong the winds are, and then how fast it's moving. So a bigger storm with stronger winds that's moving slow is actually going to produce a lot of storm surge in areas along the coast, and especially for inland bays and estuaries. Think about the Potomac River south of DC, the Chesapeake Bay, a slow moving storm that makes landfall in southeast Virginia and then tracks into central and northwest Virginia. That's going to be a big problem for this area because it's going to push a lot of water into the Chesapeake, and that's going to make its way up and cause a lot of flooding. But even faster moving storms can cause significant storm surge, but that's going to be focused mainly right along the coast. The water does not penetrate further inland with faster moving storms. Um, and it's very difficult to gauge where the worst of the storm surge is going to occur more than, say, a few days out from a hurricane making landfall. That's why it's important if you're in an evacuation zone, not so much in this area, but if you lived right along the coast in Virginia or in Maryland on the eastern shore, it's important to just heed any local evacuation notices from storm surge from local officials because the water can rise. If it's more than 3 feet, that's what we consider to be life threatening. And you're talking about 3 feet of moving water with waves on top of it, wind. So it's just not a good situation to be in. So if you ever and not just for this area, but if you find yourself in another part of the country and it's under a storm surge warning and you're told to evacuate, it's really important that you heed the information from local officials in that situation. And the biggest storm surge impacts in recent memory, really, in our area was from Isabel. Significant amounts of flooding along the Potomac and Chesapeake Bay. Just some of the water levels listed there in Annapolis, in Baltimore and DC. You had significant flooding at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. In DC, the Georgetown area, there was a lot of flooding there. Old Town Alexandria was 5 to 6 feet of water in parts of the city. So we've seen impacts like this before. from hurricanes. They are rare, but when they do occur, they are extremely significant. And then the wind aspect of it. So we have a lot of trees in this area and trees that are prone to being knocked over by winds that don't generally have to be that strong. So even a tropical storm moving through this area can cause a lot of wind damage with trees. And then the stronger the storm is, if it is a hurricane, you can expect to see significant tree damage across this region. And a lot of people think, okay, this is a hazard that's focused to the coastline, that's focused to just areas kind of along or east of 95. But no, if you have a strong storm that's moving pretty quickly, you can get that wind to push pretty well inland. So even parts of the Shenandoah Valley and western Maryland could see a lot of strong winds from a hurricane that is already made landfall but has moved into that area pretty quickly. So those winds can translate um, inland at times, and they can cause some significant impacts as we've seen historically. And then just a little bit of a couple tidbits about just some of the strongest winds we've seen in this area from tropical storms and hurricanes moving through. Listed there, the most significant was the highest wind gust from a hurricane in Maryland was at the Patuxent River NAS station, and that was from, I believe, from Hurricane Hazel back in 1954. There was a lot of damage from that storm, from the wind aspect of it, and so eventually, in the future, we'll see a storm like this move through this region. So that's why we always have to be prepared because you never know when it's going to be that year. And then the final hazard I can speak to here with hurricanes is tornadoes. Now, the most prolific tornado producing hurricane on record was Hurricane Ivan back in 2004. So in this area, there were 35 separate tornadoes that impacted Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland. You can see there all the tracks on the left with the listed intensities from F0 to F2 and F3. And that is that was a significant outbreak of tornadoes in this area. So generally your tornadoes, they're gonna favor the right front quadrant of a tropical storm and a hurricane, depending on where the storm is moving. So that right front quadrant, that's where you get the most amount of wind shear in a tropical system that you can favor a tornado development in the outer rain bands. So generally, when a hurricane is making landfall like this, the tornado threat is going to be the first one that you encounter, and then you'll have to deal with the flooding rainfall, and then the wind and the surge as the main part of the storm come towards this area. But Ivan was really bad. You had several days of outbreaks from that, not just in this area, but across much of the southeast and up into the northeastern U.S. as well. And then these are just a list of some of the other hurricanes that have made landfall in the U.S. and produced a lot of hurricanes as they moved up. So a lot of most all of these storms have been retired, not just from the tornado impacts, but also wind surge and flooding rainfall. And in our area of responsibility here at the Baltimore, Washington office, so we had those 35 tornadoes across the 3 states, and the significance of it was that there were 12 F2 tornadoes. It's pretty rare for even the remnants of a hurricane to produce violent tornadoes of F2 or EF2 or greater. But we had 12 from the remnants of Ivan and one F3 tornado, so it was significant. But there were no fatalities. So the warnings came out quickly. They came out with plenty of lead time. So we were able to at least help people tell them that tornadoes were coming. They sought shelter, and we had no fatalities from those tornadoes, which is fantastic. And that's what we want to see. We want to be able to get everybody through these storms without anyone losing their lives. You can always rebuild a home. You can't bring back somebody if they have lost their life. Just keep that in mind. And then another aspect of tropical systems that we don't really consider is the kind of longer term impacts. There's a lot of stress involved with these systems as they're coming on shore, and people have to make plans. And we've seen a lot of indirect fatalities just related to the stress. So mainly heart attacks from folks, but also with people who have vehicle accidents, losing electricity and losing the ability to seek medical care that needs electricity in those cases. And then also just from evacuations themselves. It's unfortunate that we see that loss of life We might not have a lot of impacts or anything else, but folks can still lose their lives. And it's also an issue with more elderly population, that they're just 8 times more likely to have an impact from the stress that is life threatening. All right, so I'm going to close out with just looking at the different ways to forecasting tropical systems. So our office here in Sterling, Virginia, we focus on the impacts and the threats from these tropical storms and hurricanes, and really bring the big picture information down to the local area. And where do we get that big picture information? That comes from the National Hurricane Center. They're located down in Miami, Florida, and they're in charge of doing the track and intensity forecasting for hurricanes and tropical storms. Now, once that forecast is out, we take all that information and we basically relay to the public and our partners, what does that mean for you? And so when you can come to our website, and we'll have that information listed there. But there is a lot of coordination that goes on between the Hurricane Center and the local forecast offices, especially for when it comes to hurricane watch warning decisions. So we are always working closely with them to make sure we get all that information out in a timely and accurate manner. So I mentioned the Hurricane Center website, nhc.noaa.gov or hurricanes.gov. You have a lot of useful information now there during the hurricane season. The tropical weather outlook, which now goes out to 7 days. Apologies for having that there, haven't changed it. But you also get the track and intensity forecast for hurricanes, where the watches and warnings are. There's a lot of useful information on this website that the public, and our partners can go to get information. So this is a very good source of weather info. And the I know everybody knows about the track, the forecast cone or the cone of uncertainty. So this tells you, where the center of the storm is forecast to be. But keep in mind that the cone does not talk about impacts. The cone is only telling you where the center of the storm is going to be, and it's only where it's going to be 2 out of 3 times, because it takes into account historical forecast error. So there's about a third of the time the center of the storm could deviate outside of the cone, and that still doesn't tell you about where the impacts are going to be. We've seen a lot of tornado, a lot of flooding rain impacts occur well away from the center of the storm. It's important to keep that in mind when you're looking at the forecast track. And these are updated, at least 4 times a day, and then every 3 hours when there's a watch warning in effect for some sort of land areas, whether it's the United States or other parts of the Caribbean and Central and South America. And one cool thing about the cone is that it has shrunk because of advancements in technology and forecaster knowledge. The purple there is what the purple cone is what the cone looked like back in 2003. You can imagine this was the cone for Hurricane Irma back in 2017, when it was just east of Puerto Rico and the Antilles, Lesser Antilles, and the hazard area would have stretched all the way from Georgia to the Yucatan Peninsula. But because of advancements in technology, now the 2023 cone that you can see there in the small red outlined area, you have a much more really narrowed area of where the impacts could be. So a lot of improvements have been made in the last 20 years, which is great, as that's going to reduce the false alarm, and it's going to help the emergency management and public officials and the public to make more informed decisions. Now, looking at another map that I think is very well known, or at least seen by the public and our partners, is the tropical storm, the wind speed probabilities. So, what are the chances that your specific area will experience tropical storm force winds, in the next 120 hours, the next 5 days? And so this takes into account, really impressive statistical modeling that takes the track of the hurricane takes the track that the Hurricane Center made, and then makes 1,000 different scenarios, just varying the track, the intensity, the speed, and the size of the storm. So this gives us a pretty good view about what are the range of possibilities. So if you have a higher percentage, you're more likely to see impacts from tropical storm as well. And then, again, this is all based on not just the historical aspects from the Hurricane Center, but it takes into account a lot of climatological and modeling into it. So it's very impressive, statistical information that we can get from those tropical storm probabilities. And one of the big things that we look at for it is how well, folks want to know how bad is it going to be and when is it going to arrive. So we can get that information from those wind speed probabilities. And this one is the most important. It's called the earliest reasonable arrival time. So this is when you should have your preparations made because there's only about a 10% chance that winds are going to start earlier than the noted time period there on the map. And so this is good if you need a lot of time to move your resources or to move yourself, your family, if you're evacuating, this is what you'd like to look at. You want to get your preparations done by this time. And then there's also the most likely time of arrival. So this assumes a perfect forecast, which we all know is very hard to attain. There can always be a little bit of a wobble in the storm or something that changes last minute. And that's not taken into account into this forecast. So generally, we want folks to use the earliest reasonable time of arrival there. And then I'll finish off by looking at the surge products. There's a lot of information out there, but the really important one for the public is the one on the right. So the storm surge watch and warnings that are issued. Now, those are speaking to the probability of life-threatening flooding from storm surge. So if you're ever in a storm surge warning, please take that seriously. That means that there could be water of 3 feet or greater, and that's going to pose a significant threat to life and property, and also generally accompanied by evacuations from local officials. So if you're in a storm surge warning, always heed that information. And then there's also on the left there, we have maps and images that show the peak storm surge forecast and then the potential for the storm surge forecast. So the one on the left shows more probabilistic information. So what are the chances that you get to certain heights? But then we have our single forecast, which is provided there in the middle in that graphic. And then you can go onto our local website, weather.gov/Washington, and you'll be able to get all that big picture information. We tune it all down to the local area and talk about our local impacts here. So you're able to find all of that on our website to be able to get information about tropical storms and hurricanes if they're going to impact our region. And then one of the cool graphics that we have is called the Hurricane Threats and Impacts graphics. And so these look at the four hazards: the wind, the surge, the flooding, and the tornadoes. And then we kind of give the probabilities or what the worst case scenario is for each of those hazards. So it's basically what should I prepare for? You look at these graphics and each of the information on there, and that really is very helpful to the public about what you should do for your own preparations. And then I'll wrap up here, just the last couple slides, just talking about the timeline of when things occur with tropical storms. So if you're more than 5 days out, you're looking at information in the tropical weather outlook on the Hurricane Center website. And then the cone will start moving into our area if we are going to be impacted. And then about 48 hours before landfall, that's when the big critical decision is made about watches. Hurricane watches, tropical storm watches, which within 36 hours of impact, then they're upgraded to warnings. And then as the storm starts to impact the area, that's when we start to get the flooding rain, the tornado impacts, the wind impacts. And that's when you'll start to see tornado, flash flood, and extreme wind warnings issued from our office. And then even after landfall, you can still get impacts from tropical storms. I mean, from those systems in terms of any lingering tornado or flooding impacts as well. And now, what you've all been waiting for, the 2023 hurricane season outlook. So this is the forecast from NOAA and the National Weather Service. The forecast for this year calls for 12 to 17 named storms, 5 to 9 of which will become hurricanes, and 1 to 4 that could become major hurricanes. Now, I've listed the average there on the right. So as you can see, the forecast kind of straddles both sides of it, and that's visible or seen in the pie chart on the left. So we have near equal chances of whether it's going to be a near normal, above normal, or below normal season. And that's because there's a lot of competing factors in the Atlantic Ocean this year that are kind of going against each other. So the big one is that the presence of an El Nino in the Pacific Ocean, which typically reduces Atlantic Atlantic Ocean hurricane activity. And that's because we get a lot of wind shear on this side of of our basin in the Atlantic. And wind shear is bad for hurricanes. But there is warmer than normal sea surface temperatures across the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean. And warmer waters mean more fuel for hurricanes and tropical storms to develop. So you have those two factors that are competing against each other, which makes the forecast for this year quite uncertain in terms of whether it's going to go above, below, or near normal. But again, either way, these are just numbers. Preparation is always important. These are just forecasts. They are not landfall forecasts. There's no way to forecast landfalling system impacts more than, say, maybe 7 days out if we see one and there's high confidence in it. So this is why preparation every year is important, regardless of what the forecast is. So begin to plan now and have your plan ready, just in case we do have an impact this year, that you're able to activate quickly and stay out of harm's way. And I'll wrap up here with the list of names. So the next one on the list is going to be Emily. We've already gone through 4 systems in the 2023 season. And you can always follow our office at the Baltimore, Washington NWS, listed there, Facebook and Twitter. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was fantastic. I even took a note because I was so freaked out of the photo of Annapolis with the kayaking. Can you
Yeah.
imagine? It is hard to imagine Annapolis so flooded that someone can just kayak right through it.
Yes. And
And
it's not just Annapolis. I mean, you'd have a lot of other areas if we saw a Hurricane Isabel again. And it's gonna happen, right? The
yeah,
weather, it's not about if, but when.
I
So
com-
when we get the impacts again.
I completely agree. But that was a powerful visual to see. And then that one about how the cone has changed over the years, I thought
Hmm.
was fascinating. That just shows how well science is helping us
Yes,
with tracking weather.
big time. Hmm.
And I thought that was really informative. It was nice to see that my name is not on the hurricane list. I'm always happy about that.
Yep. Same here. No Hurricane Kevin.
um, and you really stress the importance of preparedness and being in the know, which is,
Hmm.
so important with all natural hazards, not just hurricanes. And I definitely wanted to ask you, do you agree with the famous saying, turn around, don't drown?
Oh yes, please. That it's unfortunate. It's Yeah, it is unfortunate and sad at the same time because
Yeah.
that's where we see a lot of the flooding fatalities from folks just driving through flooded roadways.
I
It is just not worth it to try
It
to do
is
that.
heartbreaking to see. So I thought I would take this time to just, get that information verified by a subject matter
Mhm.
expert since we are
Yes.
lucky enough to have your time. But thank you so much. I thought that was really great. And do you have any final things that or a takeaway that you want to say?
Yeah, you're welcome. This is awesome. We're always here for the public. We want to make sure everybody's safe and prepared for tropical storms and hurricanes, but just any other weather hazard that might impact this region. I mean, we get them all. Flooding, tornadoes, severe weather, wind. So again, the for the hurricane stuff, this is the time. There's a lot of information out there on Fairfax County websites, Hurricane Center website, our website, FEMA. Lots of preparedness resources out there for everybody to get their plan in place, and just be ready just in case something comes down the road.
Thank you. And for everyone that is watching this in Fairfax County, we have our community emergency response guide through our department that has a lot of information on preparedness, response, and recovery related to hurricanes. And you can see the URL down on the screen. So it's really great information, and I really hope that everyone checks it out. But thank you so much, Kevin. This was really informative. And here's hoping to a calm rest of hurricane season.
Yes, yes, for everyone involved, for sure. We'd love a quiet season. It's been a while since we have had one of those, and yeah, thank you
We're
so much
doing
for having me.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You as well. Bye.